One of the funnest things I grow in my garden every year, homegrown popcorn, is not only colorful and delicious, but unwrapping each ear feels like opening presents on Christmas morning. I didn't start out as a great popcorn grower though. My first couple years I grew really measly spotty ears, but now I grow an entire year's worth of incredibly gorgeous popcorn every single year. And I'll show you exactly how we do it with all the details of how we plant and grow, harvest, shell, store, and pop it. And at the end of the video, I'll answer some frequently asked questions like, what does homegrown popcorn taste like? And what varieties do I like to grow? And I think we should start at the beginning with how to plant. If you remember one thing, remember that for best pollination, plant corn in a grid rather than in long rows. For example, if you have 100 seeds, it's much better to plant 5 rows of 20 than 2 rows of 50. It's also important that you plant enough popcorn plants. Aim for a bare minimum of 20. This will ensure that there's plenty of pollen floating all around and you'll get good pollination and nice full ears of corn and not sad, measly looking ones. To get started, we drag a hoe down the rows to mark them. We don't use any synthetic fertilizer in our garden for any crop, but we do usually amend with composted manure when we plant, spreading a layer of it down each marked row. I typically plant my popcorn in a part of our garden that has kind of semi-poor soil, so this gives them a little bit of a boost. If you have average garden soil or good soil, this extra step wouldn't be necessary. We've grown popcorn for many years in better parts of our garden without it. We use a small tiller to work the compost into the top couple inches of the soil. This tiller is one of our favorite tools. We use it to prep the garden for planting in the spring where it's needed. And it's especially useful for helping us weed between garden rows during the growing season. I'll put a link for it in the video description below. Once that's done, we hoe a row again. This time Carl drags the hoe down each row to create a pretty deep furrow. And while he's doing that, I'm picking out which seeds I want to plant. You can influence the colors of your popcorn by picking and planting the prettiest kernels. Corn does best when it's direct sowed, that is, planted directly into the ground instead of starting it in pots. We space the seeds about 10 inches apart in the row, and the rows are 2 feet apart. You should check your seed packet in case they have a different recommendation based on the specific variety and the height that it gets. If I'm using older seed or it's a really dry, cool spring, I might put 2 kernels in each spot and then thin them later. But if I'm using fresh, good seed and the weather is warm and moist, I typically have great germination, especially from my own saved seed, and I only plant 1 seed per spot. It's up to you if you want to overseed or not. Once the seeds are in the furrow, we use the hoe again to cover them up with about 1 inch of soil. The last step is to tamp it down so that we have good seed-soil contact. We live where it rains, and this garden is in a location that's a little bit difficult to water, so we time our corn planting for when the soil is already moist or there's going to be a lot of rain in the forecast. If you don't have rain or moist soil, water them in well, but do so gently so that you don't wash all the soil away. As far as when to plant, for me in Zone 4 Wisconsin with the last frost date in mid-May, I usually plant corn during the last week in May after all danger of frost has passed and the temperatures are consistently warm. Corn seeds will germinate best when the soil temperature is about 60 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer. You wouldn't want to plant them too early and have them just rot in the ground because it's too cold. The great thing about popcorn is that it's a set it and forget it kind of crop. Just let it grow and keep it weeded and keep it watered if it doesn't rain. The general recommendation is that popcorn needs 1 inch of water per week, but I can tell you from experience that my corn doesn't always get quite that, and it seems to do fine. Like all plants, popcorn will do best if it doesn't have to compete with weeds for its resources. We typically weed 2 or 3 times in the first month when it's still really small, like up to 1 foot tallish and growing. Once it's knee-high or taller, the leaves do a really good job of shading the soil and preventing weeds the rest of the season. It's a low-maintenance crop in this way, which I really appreciate. Do you need to worry about cross-pollination with popcorn? Yes, you do. If your popcorn is too close to other types of corn like sweet corn or field corn, and they're pollinating at the same time as those corns, and some of that pollen from those corns reaches your popcorn, it can cause your popcorn not to pop. Now that's a lot of things that have to go right at the same time, or wrong I should say, but it certainly can and does happen. Corn is pollinated when pollen is produced on the tassel at the very top of the stalk, and it's blown by the wind down onto the silks of the ear. Each silk is connected to one kernel, and each of these silks has to get a pollen grain on it for it to form a full kernel and a full cob of corn. Here's a cool example of a yellow popcorn that was cross-pollinated by a colorful variety. This ear was supposed to be entirely yellow, but the colorful kernels are where a grain of pollen from a different variety landed on the silk that corresponds to those kernels. Isn't that so neat? It's not as big of a deal to have one variety of popcorn cross-pollinated by another variety of popcorn because even though it'll be the wrong color, it still has the right genetics and the right composition inside the kernel to make it pop, unlike if it's pollinated by a flower corn or a sweet corn, for example. To prevent crossing, experts say to keep different corn types a half-mile apart. This is the gold standard. You can outsmart this a little bit though. To give you an idea, I'm standing in the popcorn patch. Past that blue building is our house and a big tree, and past those is my sweet corn. I've never had a problem with them crossing. If I swing to the left, past those tall trees, is the neighbor's field corn. It's never crossed with those either, but the wind blows in a favorable direction. If anything, my popcorn is pollinating his field corn. Sorry, neighbor. Wind direction and speed is a huge factor, and it can either help you or hurt your efforts. Harvesting popcorn. This is the fun part. Finally! You've waited all season for this, and I can't stress this enough. Popcorn really should be fully dry on the plant before it's picked. At the end of the growing season, in early fall for us here, the ears will turn from green to yellow and then papery dry and brown. And after the ears start to dry, the entire stalk will start to dry as well. And if possible, wait until the stalk is somewhat brown and dry before picking the ears. Do pick them as soon as they're dry though to prevent rodents and birds from finding them before you do. This right here is the ideal look for a popcorn patch that's ready to harvest. This is an ear that looks like it could be dry, but it's not. It's trying to trick you. Don't pick an ear that is green tinged. The risk is that if you pick popcorn prematurely, it won't pop as good, and it might not even pop at all, so this is really important. Besides that, this ear has so much moisture still in the cob and the kernels that it will be prone to molding, and you don't want that. Look at how soft these kernels are. They should be hard as a rock when the corn is harvested, and I can still break these in half. This corn is just not ready yet. On the other hand, this is an ear that's fully dry and ready to be picked. You can see that every single layer of husk is brown and dry all the way to the inside, and there's no green tinging to it whatsoever. When that exciting day finally comes and the corn is ready for harvesting, use a downward motion to pull them off the stalks. Usually the faster and quicker you can pull them, the better and the easier they'll come off. What about rain in the forecast? I wouldn't recommend picking the popcorn if it's wet from rain. Let it dry out first. If the corn is ready or like so close to being ready and there's a whole entire week of rain in the forecast, I might pick it before the rain, or at least pick the ones that are most dry. But what about frost? It's usually the cold weather of fall that causes me to pick my popcorn. If I'm careful in my short northern growing season about the varieties I select, they'll be just dry enough to pick by the time the cold weather forces me to. Corn that is in the process of drying can tolerate a light frost, so don't think you have to go and pick it quickly if an early frost is looming. A hard freeze is different though, and ideally you don't want your corn to go through a hard frost. If the husks are totally yellow and mostly brown and dry, and there's a hard freeze coming, I'll pick it, even if it's a touch early. If it's gonna get very, very cold and your corn still has a lot of green in the husks and the kernels are soft, it's probably gonna not make it as a popcorn crop, though you might be able to salvage it as a flour corn or a grinding corn instead. Now the shucking. This is like opening presents on Christmas morning, especially if you've grown a colorful variety. And the thing to know about shucking is that it's absolutely vital that you remove the husks from the popcorn immediately after picking it. Otherwise, it can mold. If the corn is very, very, very dry, I find it can stay in the husks for like a day or two at the most before it needs to be shucked. How you shuck the corn depends on what you want to use it for. If you only intend for the corn to be used for food, you can shuck it quickly by pulling back several husks at a time, and then once the corn is unwrapped, break the husks off from the ear just like that. If you have beautiful full ears that you want to double as a fall harvest decoration, you'll shuck it more intentionally. If it has this long wonky stem still attached, bend it over and break it off like I just did. And then peel the husks back one at a time, which will cause them to stay sticking straight up in a lovely decorative way. Sometimes they can be a little bit wild and unruly, and if that's the case and you want them to have a more straighter appearance, you can put a loose rubber band around them to help keep them in position while they dry. Speaking of drying, even though we let the corn dry on the plant, it still needs to dry more before it will pop well and before storing it. So we set the shucked ears in a single layer somewhere with decent airflow. An extra table works well, or sometimes we'll put it on a hardwood floor if we have a lot of popcorn and it's already pretty dry. If your popcorn was picked prematurely and it has a lot of greenness and a lot of moisture still, you might need to elevate it by putting it on something raised like mesh fencing so that air can get underneath it better. You'll want to make sure you're drying it in a controlled environment, so not subject to the elements, and also somewhere where rodents won't steal it because they will really want to steal it. How long it takes to finish drying will be different for everyone. Factors like when it was harvested, how dry it was, and the relative humidity can affect how fast it dries. Mine usually takes a month or two. We typically harvest in October, and then I just leave it be and then deal with it after the holidays when life slows down, and that seems to be a pretty good schedule. So how do you know when it's dry and ready? Well, the moisture content of popcorn should be between 11 to 15.5% for it to pop well. That doesn't really mean much to us because it's not something we'll actually test, but I do want you to know that there's a Goldilocks point. If it has too much moisture or too little, it won't pop well. And the best way to test it is to try popping some. You probably want to let it dry for 3 to 4 weeks in the house before trying to test pop it. To do it, I simply pop a handful of kernels and see how they do. When I get a good pop rate, meaning only a few unpopped kernels or old maids at the bottom, I'll test a larger quantity from multiple ears to double check. And if that pops well too, I know it's ready. If it doesn't pop well, I'll wait another week or two and try again. So what do you do if your corn has been drying in the house for 2 months and you've been testing it every week and it still doesn't pop? I'm sorry to say that it probably isn't going to. It could be the variety, as some corns marketed as popcorns don't actually pop well. I'm looking at you, glass gem corn. It's a really terrible popcorn, so if you're growing glass gem and it doesn't pop, that's why. It's not your fault. It could be that it came from bad seed stock, or it was cross-pollinated, or it didn't dry properly on the plant. Not all is lost, though. Popcorn that doesn't pop can be used for flour, or cornmeal, or masa, or even as treats for your chickens. Once the corn is popping well, it's time to shell it immediately. Think about it like this. We're waiting for it to dry down to the perfect moisture content, and then we want to capture it at that place and time and prevent it from drying too much more. Shelling is removing the kernels from the cob, and it's one of my favorite winter activities to do sitting next to the fire. There are several ways to do it, and some are easier than others. The free option, of course, is to just use your hands. I'd recommend wearing gloves so it doesn't tear up your skin. We did it this way for many years, working in sessions a little bit at a time because it can get tiresome if you've got more than a dozen ears or so. Start at the bottom of the ear, the wider end, loosening the first row or two of kernels, and then work your way around the cob and up to the tip of it. You'll need a little hand strength for this, but it's actually kind of fun and satisfying work. A few years ago, we discovered these hand shellers, which were life-changing. We grow hundreds of ears of corn every year, and this allowed us to shell it about 10 times faster and with a little less pain. The corn shellers we use are made by Decker, and they're sold at many different agricultural type supply stores. I'll try to link them below. There's a small and a large version, and they're hard to tell apart from a photo online, but you can see the difference in the teeth. The larger one has more space between the teeth, and they're smaller. We have and use both, but we actually use the smallest one more often with popcorn. We'll get ourselves set up and sit at the dining table with our corn shellers and a couple large baking pans to catch the corn. It's not a bad way to spend a cold winter's day, actually. You just insert the corn through the center and twist it through. They're kind of like nubbins on the inside of the sheller, and they knock off all the kernels. It works pretty slick. As our pans fill up with corn, we offload it into a big bowl to get it ready for the next step, which is winnowing. If your corn has some ugly spots like this is actually where a bird was pecking through the husks to get at the corn while it was still on the plant, and now it's brown. You should shell around those spots. Don't let that get into your good corn. It can actually sometimes be a little bit moldy in those areas, so pick around it to get the good stuff. Popcorn, like most seeds, will have some debris and chaff that needs to be removed, and the easiest way to do it is to get 2 big bowls and pour the popcorn back and forth between them. The higher you get, the more room there is for the chaff to blow away. Of course, you need a semi-windy day to do this, or at least just not a completely still one. We usually pour the popcorn back and forth like 3 or 4 times. We don't remove every single piece of chaff, but as long as you get most of it, it won't blow all over your kitchen like a confetti popper when you go to pop your popcorn. As far as storage, I think the best way to store popcorn is in glass jars. I use large half-gallon or quart jars with the 2-piece standard canning lids. Nothing fancy or special needed there. Plastic bags are not airtight and they will allow gas exchange through the plastic over time. For this reason, it isn't a great choice, especially if you're storing an entire year's worth of popcorn. If you do want to use bags, Mylar is a better choice, especially for longer term. Now that you've learned how to grow popcorn, the next step is learning how to pop it. And my favorite tool for this job is an air popper, just like this one. Homegrown popcorn can be popped in all the regular ways too, like on the stovetop or in the microwave, but it can be a little bit more finicky than store-bought, especially heirloom types. And an air popper never fails me. I'll link mine below. If your homegrown popcorn isn't popping well for you, it's definitely worth trying an air popper. I also love it because I like to top my popcorn with a lot of butter, so I like that I don't need additional oil to pop it in. Now I want to answer some of the frequently asked questions I get whenever I talk about popcorn, like, what does homegrown popcorn taste like? Well, it tastes like popcorn. I think that most store-bought popcorns, whether they come already popped in a bag or as kernels that you pop yourself, are bred for things like size and reliable popping and delicate hulls, and not necessarily for flavor. So if you grow an heirloom popcorn, it's going to be more robustly popcorn flavored. It's kind of like eating an heirloom tomato versus a store-bought hybrid tomato. They both taste like a tomato, but one is definitely better than the other. What color does that beautiful, colorful popcorn pop into? You can see here that, unfortunately, it's just boring white or yellow. The color on the outside is a tiny piece of the shell and it does not translate to the interior, but that doesn't mean it's not still fun. Can any dry corn be popped for popcorn? No, it needs to be a variety that is specifically popcorn. The difference between popcorn and the other types of corn like sweet corn and corn that's ground into cornmeal or flour is the ratio of harder starch versus softer starch. Popcorn specifically has soft starch on the inside and hard starch on the outside, which is what makes it explode when it's heated. Other types of corn have a different makeup that doesn't allow them to pop. What variety of popcorn do you recommend growing? I always think people should just grow whatever speaks to them. Look through any of the major seed catalogs and you'll find multiple varieties of popcorn. I'll link some of my favorite companies below. If you're wondering about the varieties that I'm showing here in this video, the yellow popcorn is a hybrid variety called Caramel Crisp. It's the type that's used for caramel corn because it pops into a very large, round form. The beautiful purple variety that you've seen is actually my own breeding work. I found some random purple ears in my corn patch about 6 years ago, and I've been saving the seed and refining the color palette ever since. I call it Midnight Purple because it has deep purples and blues with pops of white and yellow, which reminds me of the starry night sky. I've grown a lot of different types of popcorn over the years. 2 varieties that have stood out are Cherokee Longear and Amish Butter. They are a couple of my favorites that you can easily find seed for. And here's a tip for my very short growing season friends. You'll need to plant varieties with a shorter growing time, otherwise they won't be ready before your first frost hits. There's a variety called Dakota Black that is reliably the fastest finishing corn I've ever grown. Try that one. There, now you know how to grow popcorn. I hope that you are inspired to give it a try. Please let me know if you do. And if you've grown it before, I would love to know your favorite varieties. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the comments below. And if you found this video helpful, I would love it if you could give it a thumbs up. And make sure to subscribe to my channel so that you are the first to know whenever a new video is posted.